TF2 is a game full of many and varied and unique game modes even among other FPS games. From payload to attack defend, every core game mode in TF2 offers a unique and fun experience from its peers. Of course, not every game mode is treated equally, obviously. Quite a few of the game modes have been neglected by Valve and left to rot by the wayside, but there is one that you can't even play anymore and haven't been able to for years. That mode is Arena. So what is Arena mode? For the less experienced viewers, let me give you a quick rundown. In Arena mode, both teams fight to the death with no respawns. You heard that right. No respawns. You die, you have to wait again until the next round to spawn. An alternative way to win is by capping one or more of the control points that become available to cap after enough time's passed. Once the round starts, the spawn rooms are no longer safe havens like they are in other game modes. They remain open for both teams to navigate and don't contain any resupply cabinets. Moreover, arena maps contain little or no health kits, which give medics and engineers a powerful advantage. Lastly, the first player to get a kill is rewarded with a few seconds of crits, which provides them and their team with some momentum that they can use to their advantage. All of this culminates in a faster paced, yet highly tactical experience where both teams are engaging in intense team fights, fighting for their very survival. Unfortunately, you can't play this mode on Valve servers anymore, as Arena mode was never included in the casual map pool that dropped with Meet Your Match. Why did this happen? Why did Arena mode not make the cut for casual mode, even after Valve had just added a new arena map to the game months before casual mode dropped in the Invasion update? Well, to put it simply, the mode was just incompatible with the casual matchmaking system Valve imposed on the game. How so? Well, for starters, arena mode rounds are short. This doesn't sound like an issue at first until you realize that casual mode is in a best 2 out of 3 format, which means that games of arena mode would only last less than 5 minutes before you're kicked back to the vote screen and possibly the main menu. This obviously isn't ideal, as you don't want players spending more time on menus than actually playing the game, and this is only exacerbated by reason 2. Unbalanced teams are more common in casual, and arena mode suffers the most from this. Since rounds with uneven teams go so fast, full games might only last 2 minutes total before the game ends. Not only that, but what happens in a steamroll in casual typically? A lot of people leave, which causes the next round to steamroll even harder. In something like payload, red teams would still have the time to potentially stall a steamroll with sentries and Uber, plus the cart stops the blue team from capping too fast due to it being on a set timer. But in a game mode like Arena or Control Points, there is no setup time. Thus, if a team steamrolls round 1, they will roll even harder round 2. And as these things tend to be, this happens to segue perfectly into reason 3. Arena mode as a game mode requires balanced teams to function more so than other game modes, and casual just can't provide that. Casual mode offers no team scramble, no good auto balance, it doesn't really fill player slots. If there's a major player difference, the game would have to constantly switch players over to balance it out, or leave people in spectators if the teams had even numbers. Neither of these are particularly enjoyable options for players, and since casual mode cannot even hope to remedy any of them, Valve simply opted to remove the game mode full stop, instead of tweaking their matchmaker to work with one of their pre-existing game modes. And honestly, Arena's not actually the only game mode that doesn't fit with the new casual system. Control Points, I'd argue, barely fits for very similar reasons. I'm sure most people that have played the mode have seen it. The endless steamrolls, half the server leaving after one round, how short the games are before the map changes, etc. But the key distinction between Control Points and Arena mode, and most likely the reason that Control Points is allowed to exist in casual mode, is two things. Control Points is A, sixes game mode, which means that Valve was sucking off sixes and left it in for posterity for them. But B, Control Points has the potential to stop steamrolls, or at least stall them. Unlike Arena mode, Control Points can stop on the last capture point before it's capped, preventing every other round from being as short as a fruit fly's lifespan. All you gotta do is stack engineers on last, and you can stop a steamroll sometimes. That's not the full story though. What about the era before casual? Some of the more knowledgeable and legacy players might know that Arena wasn't even available in the quick play map pool either. That's really a shame, as while the game mode's certainly divisive among players, honestly, I personally enjoy it. I find the lack of respawns and focus on team fights creates a more exhilarating and fast-paced experience when compared to the rest of the game. It's not uncommon to have a situation where both teams are neck and neck, cheering on their remaining teammates, and that kind of camaraderie just isn't nearly as common in other game modes, or honestly other games, period. In some ways, it's like a more competitive experience, while also being an everyday pub experience. And in fact, I'm not even the first person on YouTube to come to this conclusion. I think Victor Overtime said it best in his Arena video. I quote,
"The opposite. The game mode has high stakes, but the short rounds stop it from being overwhelming. I see it as the perfect balance between casual and competitive gameplay."
I'll obviously link his video in the description. While I know there's a stigma around taking the game too seriously, I think there's a healthy niche for it that is supported by this game mode. So why was it left behind? We never got an official explanation from Valve, but some people have attempted to derive explanations on their behalf. Equally as puzzling is that very few people, from what I could find, have questioned Valve's decision to exclude it from the map pool, and have doubled down on agreeing with Valve's decision for the reasons they've come up with. So, I would like to go through some of the community's best and most compelling criticisms that I could find, and then I'll discuss what I think are the most likely reasons that Valve might have removed it, and whether or not they think they're right to do so. While I don't think Arena's perfect, I will try my best to speak on behalf of the game mode, since I really haven't seen other people trying to do the same. To start us off, one of the most common points I have found players say is that having no respawns is a bad thing. Say it's bad because it's too punishing and or boring, especially for new players. Now I do agree that Arena is more punishing than other game mode when it comes to dying, but this is also what makes it so intense and interesting. Since the threat of death is constant, it creates an invigorating and adrenaline-pumping environment where everyone is fighting for their life and the lives of their teammates. I would say the same to those who think it's just boring. Plus, I feel like when people say this, they treat it like they have to wait for 5 to 10 minutes like it is in versus Saxton Hale, when in reality the average round of Arena is barely 2 minutes long, and utilizes the control point to keep rounds from being really any longer than that. Like I said, you're trading longer respawns for more intense experience. This dynamic would be heavily understated if there were respawns. I would also say that I have noticed people in arena matches are a lot more talkative, which I think is a result of having to wait longer. I think this potentially strengthens the camaraderie and rivalry aspects of the game, which is a nice touch in my opinion. As for new players, there was a quote-unquote feature that existed in the game when it was still in quick play that would have mostly alleviated this potential issue. As you can see from the image, there is text that specifies what kinds of players certain game modes are best suited for. For payload, recommended for all skill levels, while payload race is recommended for advanced players. This would have filtered out most lower skill players from playing the mode until they decided that they were ready to try out the more difficult mode, which is Arena. But even though I would acknowledge that Arena is more suited for advanced players and beginners, a new player could potentially learn more about how to play effectively by watching how his teammates are playing on Deathcam. There are many ways to learn the game after all, and spectating players while dead is one of them. But I would argue that there may often not be a lot for new players to learn from only having 15 seconds of watching someone else to see how they could be improving themselves. Another point people seem to have is this idea that Arena just doesn't fit into the game because it features no respawns and the fact that killing players is the main objective. It is seen by some people as being out of place in a game where pushing payload carts to capping control points is the norm. An objective based around killing players could also be seen as a bad thing because the game is meant to have multiple layers of engagement. For instance, a newbie soldier can opt to just push a payload cart instead of trying to kill people. To start with that first point, I have some respect for those who will try and intuit design rules or conventions that Valve themselves doesn't state explicitly. Obviously, I do so myself, I wouldn't be making this video otherwise. But the idea that this sort of game mode fundamentally doesn't fit because of what it does differently just seems misplaced. First of all, there's literally no solid evidence to suggest that a precedent was intended or even desired subconsciously by Valve. In fact, all the evidence I could find points to the contrary. When the game launched, all maps that could stalemate came with sudden death as opposed to just stalemating. A server option still exists to this day to toggle sudden death on for community servers. Oh, but why did they change it to be toggled off by default? Well, I ultimately don't know, and while I do have my own theories, the only people that know is Valve. But why are we presuming that it's because it's universally bad? Or because they hatched some new rule about player-based objectives or respawns post-launch? Especially considering that they made Arena a game mode in the first place, it seems like they didn't think the kind of game mode offered by sudden death was a bad thing. If you ask me, they probably thought sudden death felt awkward to players being in matches where they had just spent the majority of their time flinging themselves at a control point or bombing the enemy team with reckless abandon. Valve might have seen players experiencing some tonal whiplash, having to radically change how they play the game in the course of a round. That would explain why they did what they did, making it a server option, and then later making Arena into its own game mode. Speaking of, did you know that Arena is actually the second game mode to be added to the game post-launch? It was added all the way back in August of 2008 during the original Heavy update. Now I know people talk about Valve losing sight of some things somewhere in the 2010s era, but for those who suggest that player-based game modes break a rule of the game's design, what do you make of that fact? Would the devs contradict themselves less than a year after launch? Or is this rule that people allude to not really real? And as for giving new players different viable options to engage with the game, I don't think this differs all that much from the normal game in that respect either. Yeah, sure, there isn't a payload card to sit on or a control point to throw yourself at, but new players aren't necessarily doing these things anyhow. Oftentimes, a new player is just chilling by an NG's buildings, lobbing rockets at the enemy team, or staying in a corner revved up as heavy. But I mean, hey, he can protect that NG, or maybe he can be that NG. Or better yet, new players can simply follow whatever their team's doing. Something that I see them do all the time, and something I did myself when I first started playing the game. As for complexity and difficulty, I think I would put this in a similar spot as Payload Race, which Valve considers to be recommended for advanced players, as stated previously. While a noob can push his team's payload card in Payload Race, it is made more complex by having to keep track of both two carts and the more varied experiences created by that between the two teams. This dynamic is similar in Arena, where your team will sometimes split into different groups, except the objective is actually much simpler since it's just killing the other team. The next point that people make about Arena, and one of the other most common points I hear, is that Arena is just deathmatch. Seems to me like when people say this, they're associating the deathmatch of Arena mode with a deathmatch of something like Call of Duty, Quake, or Counter-Strike, but Arena is so different from traditional deathmatch in so many ways that I honestly think to present this as a serious point is really dismissive. Not be too autistic with definitions, I'm using deathmatch to refer to the kind found in games like COD or Quake, where you kill the enemy as many times as possible to score points to win for your team. If you have some other definition, or maybe think mine isn't good, feel free to, roast me in the comments or whatever, but to me, this is what people usually refer to when they make this comparison, and when you look at it this way, I think you can see that the differences between Arena and something like COD or Quake are pretty apparent. I will get back to the Counter-Strike comparison in a moment though, since there's more to say about that than the other two. What's really interesting is that there are these people who seem to decry Arena for being deathmatchy, but they will accept maps like Hightower or Watergate, maps that essentially they accuse Arena of being, and then some. Hightower has such a reputation for this that many servers will go as far as to remove the cart entirely with plugins to prevent the game from ever ending. As for Watergate, the whole player destruction game mode pretty much matches the exact definition of Team Deathmatch. The objective is to get as many kills as possible, which lines up with the comparison for it. In the case of Watergate, the kills aren't counted on their own because obviously these kills convert to the bottles that you give to the UFO in order to win. I mean, this makes it feel like it's different, even though the gameplay loop's nearly the same. The only exception to it being team deathmatch is if somehow the enemy team kills you, but you still don't cap all their bottles. That and the fact there even is a cap, but this premise is still very deathmatchy already. Going back to the Counter-Strike comparison, while it actually has deathmatch in it, Arena seems more similar to the actual game of Counter-Strike than the deathmatch mode. In the normal game, you win by killing all the opposing team, or arming or disarming the bomb. Valve even apparently makes a reference to this similarity in the casual description game files, as discovered by S4 Videos in a video he made discussing Arena mode, which link in the description. Am I supposed to think that just because they share a similarity that one is effectively identical to the other? Or better yet, that just because they share this similarity that disqualifies the value of TF2's rendition? Or that it's bad? Personally, I don't really care if it happens to be somewhat similar to another game, if it's good and it fits the game it's in. Another point that I've seen brought up is that the mode apparently has poor class balancing. Sniper is apparently overpowered, Spy is useless, and Medic and Engineer absolutely required. I find this pretty strange, considering that Arena was basically engineered with class balance in mind to a degree that I haven't really seen Valve stress nearly as much in regards to other game modes. Here's what it says on the update page for Arena. Quote, TF2 Arena keeps the class diversity of Team Fortress 2 while focusing goals around combat between two teams. Where other game modes lean towards a broad overall strategy for the team over a number of lives, Arena concentrates on the specific tactical choices the teams make in a single fight. And the other one here, rounds tend to be very fast and highly competitive, with an emphasis on your team's class makeup and your plan to counter the opposing team's class choices. And that's not all. They even go into specific detail about how each class can serve a vital role in Arena specifically, even Pyro. I don't want to just read off the entire update page, but I'll have it on screen for the remainder of this section here if you want to read it yourself, and the link, as always, is in the description. I'll be quoting some of this later anyhow. Now to tackle these classes one at a time here. Sniper being overpowered makes sense in theory, but in Arena mode, this is just not true, and that becomes apparent when you playtest it. Sniper in most game modes consistently can get kills by shooting people doing the objective, as there's often sightlines by something like a payload cart or a control point. And this seems like it would carry over to Arena, since the maps tend to be more open, and because of that, be even more of an issue in a game mode where every kill matters. In practice, this doesn't really turn out to be the case. How so? Well, in Arena, Sniper doesn't have a centralized objective like a control point so that he can get these easy kills. He actually doesn't really know where the enemies are half the time because they're mobile and moving around the map, which means he can be easily flanked on a good arena map such as Lumberyard or Ravine. No doubt, he's still a strong class in the right hands, as his instant kill will always be good, but he's by no means overpowered in the mode. To give the claim some credit though, sentiment might be due to Sniper being way too strong on Watchtower specifically, since the map is really open, making his sightlines insane, like one spawn to the other insane. As for Spy being useless in the mode, another one I can understand the sentiment, as I also used to think so. But Spy actually serves a very unique and valuable role in the mode. His value comes from two things: reconnaissance abilities and his ability to get important picks easier than the other classes. For the first thing, that's not just me making this up, that's something that the devs themselves said on the update page that introduced arena mode. And I think the devs said it best. Knowing the location of the enemy team can often mean the difference between a win and a loss. Spy being able to recon information while invisible gives him a useful niche that other classes cannot replicate. And as for the value in important picks, I think that's mostly self-explanatory. Every kill matters in arena mode, so Spy being able to do so instantly has its purpose, especially if the Spy manages to kill a particularly troublesome player, like that aforementioned Sniper, or a medic. That's one less obstacle in your team's way. Now, I mentioned that Spy can do this recon, but there is actually a problem with that, and it affects everyone, not just Spy. And that's all talk. You'll know what I mean if you play on community servers where all talk is often the norm, as opposed to team talk, which is the only thing you get on Valve servers. I love all talk, but when it's enabled, players are disincentivized from talking to their team about any tactics, as obviously it would backfire because the enemy would also know. This matters on Arena especially for players who are trying to coordinate effectively, and Spy, being one of these classes, is indirectly nerfed by this, which is a real shame because it's one of his most underappreciated supportive aspects in the normal game too. The solution for this is that there should be a dedicated button for both Team Voice Chat, V, and All Talk. Maybe something like B if that wasn't occupied. This is something that I honestly feel should just be in the base game. Not everyone wants to talk to the enemy team in voice chat when they speak, so giving players the option to only speak to teammates would greatly improve the experience overall, and I really doubt it would be very hard to add. Like I said, this is a general improvement for the game as a whole, not just arena mode, but I feel as though it was relevant to mention here because the dynamic between all talk and player coordination affects arena mode the most, particularly Spy. Now, the argument that holds more merit, however, is the claim that certain classes are required by the mode. The biggest suspect classes for this are Medic and Engineer due to the scarcity of health packs on arena maps. While you are encouraged to have a source of healing, no classes are necessarily required in arena mode. If you have no support classes, you just have to keep that in mind when playing. You could run 9 scouts and still secure victory. It's all about how you and your team choose to play. Because the mode is fast and typically short, you can simply often substitute a medic for a more aggressive strategy. Increasing damage output will offset any health advantages that the enemy team may have if they chose to run a medic. After all, enemy can't hurt you if you're dead. Compare this to other game modes that have respawns. When you kill an enemy, they will eventually come back and they will damage you. This isn't to say medic is more or less needed in arena than other game modes, but he certainly isn't required. As for Engineer, while his dispensers are useful, the fact that they're stationary limits their effectiveness. Standing still in arena could potentially be risky, as it makes you more vulnerable to a surprise attack. And as for his Sentry, its effectiveness is limited by the fact there isn't a central area where people will play, like a card or a control point. This makes its area denial not as strong, since players aren't guaranteed to walk into the area controls. Now, I've actually found that Engineer, without the Gunslinger, specifically, can be pretty underpowered on a lot of the arena maps, even the good ones. And I mentioned earlier that NG doesn't really have a central objective to build by. Now that keeps him from being necessary, but there is honestly more than that. The issue is that Engineer often can't get a building set up fast enough to warrant running him. After all, why want an NG if his gun only appears outside of the first big fight? Mind you, his buildings are useful, but they're not useful fast enough typically. Now, I would suggest a pretty simple change to fix this. Let Engineer build and spawn before the gates open. That way, he at least has a building pre-made before the first battle so that he can be useful faster. It also would allow him to make an interesting choice between prioritizing a dispenser for health and ammo for his team, or a sentry for damage. Still unconvinced? Let's say hypothetically, Engineer Medic were required. Why would them being necessary in arena mode be bad? Well, the obvious answer to that is that we don't want players to be forced to play a class they don't want to, which is fair. But is Engineer not basically required on any defensive hold in the normal game? That is sentry gun defending the objective, pushing the payload card or capping a control point is exponentially easier. Defense can almost never win without at least one Engineer on any asymmetrical game modes. Same deal with medic. You basically need to run a medic on any of the asymmetrical game modes, as his uber charge is a necessity for the offensive team in most situations. Imagine pushing any last hold on a map without a medic. It is possible, but most likely it won't happen in your normal pub. So again, if hypothetically, Arena Mode did require these two classes, which it doesn't, how would this be any different from other game modes? Why would it only be bad when it's Arena that has this dynamic? Now, a talking point I've heard thrown around quite a lot by detractors is that King of the Hill is just a better version of Arena. Now, that claim implies that the two game modes play similarly, and looking at their similarities, it's easy to see why someone might think this. The maps are mirrored, there's a control point at the center of the map, and some of the King of the Hill maps are carryovers from their Arena counterparts, such as Nucleus, which was an Arena map first. However, upon further inspection, these two game modes actually play pretty differently. How so? Well, in King of the Hill, the maps funnel both teams into the central capture point. On a good King of the Hill map like Viaduct, since players are all funneled to the point, they will interact with it more. The focus of the map is the control point. Versus Arena mode, where it's actually the exact opposite. A good Arena map does not centralize its layout around the control point. How? Well, it makes the actual control point not easy to defend. The cap has many entry points, which makes it very vulnerable and not easy to defend. As well, there are many ways to avoid touching the point altogether, which naturally opens up a player's options for where they can go instead of just focusing them to the point. This causes the point to be an alternative way to win, rather than it being the way to win. That's why a map like Viaduct, while being a great King of the Hill map, would be a pretty bad Arena mode map. Likewise, I think that a map like Nucleus actually plays better as an Arena map than a Koth map. I've noticed that most people play King of the Hill Nucleus to frag, seeing the capture point as an afterthought that leaves you incredibly vulnerable to all kinds of spam. And I don't blame them. But this is the kind of thing that Valve wanted to avoid when making their objectives, as can be seen with Payload, which incentivizes you to push the cart by giving you health, ammo, and cover. These two game modes, Arena and King of the Hill, play pretty differently, despite it looking the opposite to some people. Not to imply that there can't be some form of middle ground when creating a map that can fit both game modes, as honestly I would say that Sawmill actually fits the bill for this. It has aspects of both Arena and King of the Hill used in moderation, which make the map play well for both. The point is wide open, but provides little bits of cover adjacent to the point with the moving saws and the stacked wood. There's high ground on the point like Lumberyard, but since the point is roomy, there's a lot of room to dodge rockets and projectiles. But if it's good enough to hold in Koth, wouldn't that make it a bad Arena map by your own logic? Well, no, because remember the longer timer before the point is able to be capped on Arena? That and having unreliable cover incentivizes both teams to find better positions to fortify and attack from. That lends well to flanking around the point as opposed to for it. And as a bonus, Sawmill also works as a CTF map. I mean, seriously, is there anything this map can't do? There's more to be said for some of the Arena maps, but that's for a later point in the video, so I'll be addressing that later on. But maybe Valve themselves thought that King of the Hill was a straight upgrade to Arena. I mean, after all, there were no new Arena maps added after King of the Hill released in 2009, outside of Bayer for the Invasion update. No, but the real reason I don't think they saw it this way is because they added Off Blast, an Arena map, in the same update that added King of the Hill. If you don't count seasonal maps or reskins, until 2015, King of the Hill didn't have as many maps in the game as Arena, in which Arena had 9. Similar deal for a mode like Capture the Flag, where until 2022, Capture the Flag didn't have as many maps in the game as Arena did all the way back in 2009. Point is, Valve probably thought that Arena had enough maps already, and they didn't want to add more and create a huge imbalance of maps between the game modes that would disperse players too much. Sound familiar? Quick note, I mentioned player destruction earlier, and I've actually seen people compare these game modes as well, saying player destruction is better, or an evolution of Arena. I'm not going to cover this one in detail in this video because honestly, I wanted to pick a criticisms that could have been reasons for Valve removing it, and this game mode was only added in 2015. Plus, I'd rather talk about player destruction in its own dedicated video. Hope that's okay. One of the more interesting points that I've heard against Arena is that rather than being a selfish deathmatch, it's actually the opposite, where the mode over-incentivizes teamwork. The idea with this is that by over-incentivizing teamwork, it's a bad thing because teamwork is meant to be emergent from people playing selfishly, as opposed to being incentivized or forced by the circumstances like it is in Overwatch. In Overwatch, teamwork isn't as emergent, if at all. It's baked into the rule set. You will play with the team or you will be punished. The other point is that if teamwork is over-incentivized, it runs counter to how things work in most, if not all, other game modes, where there's a spectrum of players based on investment, motive, etc., that coexist. All the way from the goofy trollger to the sweaty tryhard. Mind you, players still play around their teammates as the game isn't single player. On a map like Dust Bowl, players are encouraged to work together to some extent, as the map puts the pressure on them with aggressive choke points and converging flanks. If a teammate is trying to get aggressive, teammates will notice and accompany them in their push. For Arena, the pressure is some form of teamwork being applied by the lack of respawns, and just like the rest of the game, the strength in numbers. After all, playing closer to your teammates means that they can back you up when fighting the enemy team. Players aren't actively forced to play as a team, but they will passively group together and play off each other. This is basically one-to-one how it works in other game modes. While players are encouraged to play together to survive, there is also a good reason for them to go fight people on their own. If a class like Scout, or Spy, or Sniper can get a good pick, it could be massively beneficial for their team, and you don't really get that sort of thing if you're playing with your team, especially on Spy. Or even some of the more silly strategies like Cable Knight or Trollger, playing away from their team opens up different avenues for killing people that they may not have had. There are valuable incentives to play away with the team, just as there are valuable incentives to play far away from them. I would go as far as to say that the way teams work together in Arena is actually a major strength of the game mode. For those that wish to treat the mode more seriously and play for their lives, there's a place for them. And as stated before, there's a place for the people who just want to mess around and get frags. Two different styles of play, but both are valid and both contribute to victory. Additionally, there's a claim that there's a prevalence of tryharding. While I have not witnessed such a thing personally in my time playing it on community servers, I do acknowledge that there is more of a high-stakes ethos that is not as strong in the other game modes. But at the same time, almost every time I've played it recently, there's at least 2 to 5 people doing something really stupid. On one of the servers I play on, there's a guy who only plays Demo Knight, and he's terrible at it. But no one really gives him flack. In fact, people actually cheer him on when he happens to be the last man standing. Regardless, I don't see a problem with a game like Arena providing the high-stakes experience for players who are looking for it. And I can already hear people saying, different game modes for different people. That sounds like the same line of thinking that got Manpower added, a game that nobody plays except for a few people. I mean, hell, why stop there, right? Add Prop Hunt, add Freeze Tag. Well, the obvious difference by now that I've hopefully proven is that Arena actually fits the game, whereas something like Manpower doesn't. Giving every class a grappling hook and the ability to get power-ups just violates many design principles from the base game. And that's just one example of that. I really don't think I need to say any more than that right now. Could be a topic for a later video. Now that we've covered all the criticisms that I don't agree with, it's time to cover some that I actually think have some validity to them. The first point, and one that I think is absolutely valid, is that the game mode will force a player, and sometimes players, to sit out of a match in spectator mode. This occurs typically when players join a fresh server for the first time, as anyone who's late to join the first match will have to wait for the round to end to join in. Also, when teams are uneven, sometimes a player must be forced to sit out in spectator. While this can be frustrating, I think it's a concession that doesn't render the game mode not worth playing. Also, it is worth noting that I believe some community servers have this uneven player-spectator rule disabled. The second criticism is against both the First Blood mechanic and random crits. The criticism is that First Blood and random crits have too much of a snowball effect in Arena mode. While I have no issue with random crits on the whole, I can see why someone might find them problematic for Arena. One of the reasons why random crits were added was to add flavor to the game's pacing. For the pacing of an average Arena match being a fraction of that of any other game mode, one can argue that the initial crit chance seems like it's too high relative to the other game modes. Interestingly, Valve actually changed how random crits worked in February of 2009, a few months after Arena released, by decreasing the initial chance to 2% from 5%, increasing the linear upscaling of crit chance with damage dealt, and lowering the max crit chance ceiling. So, it seems like they addressed this criticism somewhat, right? In the other game modes, I'd say this fix was fairly effective compared to that which existed before it. But remember what I said about Arena's pacing? Compared to a normal game that can go on for upwards of possibly 15 minutes, the average Arena match can end in a tenth of that time, meaning there could be an imbalance in how pacing is affected by random crits in either game mode. The goal of random crits, in my opinion, is to do more with the individual player experience than it is with the outcome of a game. Simply put, in a game of, say, Payload, if your team's victory rests solely on you not getting random crit, then you probably don't deserve to win. But in Arena, this notion is called into question more, because you don't respawn and the pacing of the matches is a lot faster. In fact, I attempted to do some math on this. These numbers are not perfect, as they are rounded in some places, which makes the chance of critting seem higher than it may actually be. In this example, this is the first fight of the match, meaning the random crit chance ramp-up most likely doesn't apply, and it assumes both teams have 12 players, and that each team has at least one of each class. Now, classes like the Heavy and Pyro have weapons that fire out a stream and check for random crits once every second, and every other stock primary weapon for the other classes fires faster than once per second. Let's say that there is a fight that lasts 6 seconds and every class is firing their weapon once per second. We are going to count Spy's revolver, Sniper's SMG, and Medic's syringe gun out of this equation for their reduced impact on the game relative to other stock weapons. However, I will count Engineer's shotgun as half a player, not that this has a big impact on the end result of the math. Plugging these numbers in using a team with 1 Spy, 1 Sniper, 1 Medic, and 1 Engineer, and the rest of the slots being filled with other classes, we get 8.5 classes firing once per second for 6 seconds with a 2% base crit chance on every shot. This means, hoping my math is correct, that there is about a 64% chance that a crit will be fired in this 6-second fight scenario. I would have liked to get the average players in a fight over the course of a match as well as other stats to be more rigorous, but I'm not really dying on the hill that random crits are a problem. I'm just trying to create a case study and show the numbers. Here's what it looks like with 2 Spies, 2 Engineers, 2 Medics, and 2 Snipers, and we're counting Engineer's shotgun as 0 instead of 0.5 players. Only a 38% chance. I personally think this scenario is very unlikely compared to the previous one, but the chance would probably be somewhere in the middle. These numbers also don't account for the chance that someone might miss, but obviously that's beyond me to model at the moment. If you look at these numbers and think that they are too high for such a fast-paced game mode where death is permanent, then I do have a change I'd propose. Simply cut the random crit rate in half. Go from 2% down to 1%. And that would give you 40% for the 8.5 combat classes and 21% for the 4 combat classes. It seems pretty satisfying to me. I wouldn't want random crits removed from the game because of reasons I'd rather explore in a different video. Now, my rebuttal to all this, that because of the incentives posed by no respawns, people will play in such a way where they avoid taking as much damage as they would compared to, say, a payload game, where one might want to commit to a daring gambit on the payload cart. That and, I personally haven't seen random crits be that much of an issue from my experience playing it on community servers. If anything, some of the most intense moments were a result of the final teammate scoring a lucky melee crit.
Late 2000s, early 2010s.
Go get him, medic! What the fuck are these fuckers? Medic duel these fuckers.
Bro has the solemn vow instead of the fucking medic saw. Bro thinks he's different.
Get him, red. Oh,
And he died.
He's clutching.
And he died.
He's clutching.
That's when he used the solemn vow instead of the saw.
Don't choke, don't choke.
No!
It literally does more DPS than
Don't choke.
Fucking get him!
it literally.
Yeah, but the Uber saw crits like every 2 seconds. So like, I don't know, your opinion is wrong.
Also, this doesn't account for people dying during that 6-second fight, which could lower the percent chance to some more reasonable numbers. And as for First Blood, pretty much the same logic applies minus the math. The only difference is that under a certain number of players, it should absolutely be disabled. On lower player counts, I have found it to be much too snowbally. Overall, I'm not sure if either of these are problematic, but one can argue for it, and I would completely understand their gripes. I think it warrants some more looking into, though. The next point that I don't think is said enough is that some of the arena maps just really aren't that well designed, and I worry that they will and have tainted people's perception of the game mode. Especially a map like Watchtower, which has become an iconic map in TF2, being featured in tons of SFMs over the years. I mean, while I don't want to deny its cultural impact, the map itself really doesn't play good. It has massive sniper sightlines, thin walkways, outrageous verticality, and a single defensive position on the entire map. Despite feeling so open, there's not really anywhere to go besides the main capture point. I mean, it's literally the only good position on the map. Other maps have some pretty glaring issues too. Look at Arena Granary. I probably don't need to spell this one out for you. What is any class that isn't a soldier, demo, or scout supposed to do here? Hide? Even off-blast, in my opinion, has some fairly big issues. If you look at the 2 maps that were made fresh for arena mode, Ravine and Lumberyard, they provide multiple viable flank routes and spread out defensive positions while having a control point that's easy to contest against while anyone tries to cap it. This is the exact opposite of off-blast, which has one long roundabout flank and a highly defensive, insulated control point that's on high ground. What this creates is matches where both teams are encouraged to immediately move into the room with the control point, pushing through the choke point leading up to it, and then fighting for the point like it's king of the hill. Taking the flank is a recipe to get your team killed and lose the round, as you're forcing them to fight without you until you can wrap back around to the point, which just takes way too long. And it's a shame because aesthetically, this map is really good. It might help if the control point was moved down underneath where the walkway is, and maybe even have the walkway removed so it's not the only strategy, like how it is on Lumberyard as opposed to, again, playing like King of the Hill. So, why did Valve remove Arena Mode? I have my own reasons as to why I think they removed it, personally. Reputable people in the community have claimed that for the 3-ish years before Valve implemented Quick Play, Arena was never a popular game mode. I'm inclined to say this claim is hearsay, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was true. I mean, it doesn't help that after Quick Play, anytime a server had the current map set to Arena, it would be unsearchable due to the lack of a dedicated Arena search option on the Quick Play screen. This, in turn, absolutely disincentivized community servers from running the mode, as doing so would draw less traffic to it. While I won't outright deny that Valve may have had their reasons for removing it, so far I am unconvinced by many of the criticisms provided by the players who claim to speak on Valve's behalf. It is possible that Valve saw a number of these criticisms as valid reasons themselves, though, or had their own reasons that I'm failing to see. Besides, if enough people don't like something, it's not really the customer's job to know why, but why do I think Valve removed it? Well, I would say that some of the criticisms stated in this video are far more likely reasons than others, and I do have my own theory on that. But first, a question. Did you know that Hydro also wasn't included in Quick Play? Not until 2016, months before Casual dropped. The group keep also got shelved for most of Quick Play's lifespan, so it looks like Arena wasn't the only thing to get axed during Quick Play's introduction. But what do all three of these things have in common, you might ask? Well, comparing them to every other map in the game at the time, I'd argue that they were the biggest outliers from the normal experience. Context. When Quick Play was added, it's important to bear in mind that the game went free-to-play in the same update. This fact likely affected Valve's choice of maps for the new system. The 3 game modes that Valve omitted, Arena, Medieval, and Territorial Control, while otherwise fine beforehand, could have been potentially confusing and or off-putting for new players. When the game was pay-to-play, new players on average had a greater incentive to keep playing because they wanted to get their money's worth. Free-to-play doesn't have this incentive, and might just be one confusing match away from uninstalling and never playing again. As a result, a new peer-to-play player's first game being on Hydro to group keep might cause them to leave. And say what you want about Arena mode, but Hydro? That map literally launched with TF2, and if nothing else deserved to stay in the map pool for being an integral part of the game's history. I see no reason why we should treat Arena any differently. I'm not arguing that Arena is a perfect game mode or that Valve should add it back into the map pool. That was never the point of this video, and I have no illusions about Valve updating the game pretty much ever again outside of stuff like Smithmas. But I would argue that whether one likes the mode or not, Arena mode deserves to be a part of TF2 still. It should be in the game, played alongside its brothers like Payload or Control Points. TF2 is still unique in how it offers players the choice of multiple different game modes that, while unique, all come together to form one cohesive package. They are a part of TF2's soul as a game. Any one of these game modes being removed makes TF2 less of itself. The lack of Arena mode in TF2 means that TF2 has a big part of itself absent, a void that is not filled. And just like Hydro, if for nothing else, it should stay playable, as it is still an important part of the game's history. How can people learn from Arena when working on their own projects if the game mode doesn't exist? And going further, can you imagine if something like Dust Bowl wasn't in the game? What about Gold Rush?
Oh, but it's got tons of choke points, it's too spammy.
Yeah man, whatever. It's Dust Bowl. It's Gold Rush. Or about Two Fort.
No one goes for the cap. It encourages turtling.
Okay, that's cool, but it's fucking Two Fort, dude. Oh, Powerhouse.
Oh, the rounds last too long. I hate fun.
Love them or hate them, they are part of TF2, just like Arena. All these maps people have their issues with, but the game would simply not be the same without them.
But all of those examples are aesthetically important for the game. What did Arena do exactly?
Simple. Lumberyard was a map that pioneered the Alpine art style for TF2, and quite frankly, it really still hasn't been topped to this day. Hell, we discussed map design earlier. Both this and Ravine pioneered a new philosophy of map design, and that's one I think has gone without thanks or even acknowledgement for over 15 years. It would be nice to hear from the horse's mouth why it was never added, but to be honest, I don't even trust the horses anymore, and most of the good ones got fired anyways. But it wouldn't surprise me if Valve removed it for, well, any of the aforementioned reasons. But considering Arena and Hydro have been making a comeback on some community servers, all it tells me is that the people who talk about why Arena or Hydro failed wouldn't even be having this conversation if Valve never excluded them from the map pool in the first place. A lot of these people just seem to be running cover for Valve's mysterious decision making. I think it would be the most disappointing if I'm right, and that they essentially removed what was otherwise a fine game mode in aligning their interests with free-to-plays who have no financial incentive to get their money's worth. This video originally was intended to be nothing more than an analysis of Arena as a game mode, because I thought, oh, it's a relatively untouched TF2 topic. But when I looked deeper into the mode, before I even decided to make this video, I had to wonder, what was this mode like? I, like many other players, did not have too much experience with it, and originally disregarded the mode entirely based on what people who were more experienced with the game had told me. But the more I investigated, the more I realized that it wasn't just under-discussed, but underappreciated. And as I played the mode for hours upon hours, I felt that I'd been missing out on the uniquely fun experience that it offered for most of my time playing this game. And I know for a fact I'm not the only person who would feel this way, so I would encourage you, the person watching this video, whether you are unfamiliar with Arena or its biggest critic, consider giving it a second chance. You might just enjoy it. I personally have found the bulk of my enjoyment from playing Arena on Castaway.tf. They have other features as well, such as reverting a lot of weapons in the game back to the way they were in 2014. And if you're not a fan of that, there are probably other servers as well that offer this experience, which I'll link in the description. Maybe other server hosts just could consider having a server that runs Arena every once in a while. And speaking of, we're actually launching a Vanilla TF2 server alongside the release of this video. It will have Arena mode on it alongside all the other maps and game modes you guys love. Just no modern slop like Venice or Bread Space or what have you. Just Vanilla TF2 pure experience. As well, it might not be up by the time you see this video, but we will also be having a stock TF2 server as well to accompany this. Like I said, it might not be up right now, but what you can expect from it, remember when the item servers went down that one day? It'll be like that basically. So that it'll be raw, pure TF2, just like this, same map pool and everything, just no unlocks. Alright, link will be in the description to those as well as the IPs. Hope to see you there. Have a good one.